Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith.
And I'm Jacob Keynes, and you are listening to the Classical Queer Podcast. Hello everybody, welcome back to the Classical Queer Podcast. Today we are very thrilled to be joined by Nick May, saxophonist, and wonderful administrator of very interesting projects, which I'm quite excited to tell you all about and to hear Nick's thought on everything that you're doing. So welcome to the podcast. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful for this.
And thanks for telling us about all your life and work. And we generally start with kind of a bio, in the sense that we want to hear the most broad strokes understanding of what you do, knowing that we're going to talk about your life and work for the next hour. But tell us about where you are, where you grew up, your music life. If you want to tell us about school, great. If not, tell us about your projects. Give us a bit of an overview.
Yeah, so right now I'm currently based in Kansas City, Missouri, not Kansas City, Kansas. People get confused with that, but so Kansas City, Missouri, where I teach here at a few different colleges, private academies, and then when I'm not doing that, I'm touring all over with the I Exist project, and so kind of backing up with that. I ended up actually growing up in Nebraska, which is in the middle of the United States. A lot of people call it kind of Farmville because there's just nothing but cornfields and just it's very rural. So I ended up actually growing up on a farm, and so started playing saxophone in 2004 in fifth grade, which that dates me and ages me really really fast. But yeah, so grew up just playing saxophone, and I would even say kind of through middle school and high school, I never actually I ended up doing well. I was lucky enough to be in a few honor bands, get a few awards and whatnot, but I never really thought of it being a career at that point. I actually wanted to go into anesthesiology because the idea of making $500,000 a year sounded really appealing. but the short version of how that story what propelled me into music was our band director had a symphony rehearsal, open symphony rehearsal at the high school one afternoon. And so he invited the whole class just to sit in if you want to do homework, whatnot. And so I remember I ended up showing up because it was a Tuesday afternoon. There was nothing going on. And they ended up, they were rehearsing, doing a full run through of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. Which ended up shaping a lot of things kind of just moving forward. But long story short, I ended up sitting about less than 5 feet in front of a full orchestra, just being washed with that as my first actual professional, higher music, whatever you want to call it. And that basically flipped the switch, and that made me want to just you know what, that's what I want to do. I want to do stuff like this. I want to be hear music, play music like this. And so now ended up doing my undergrad and master's in music. And then ever since then, when I graduated in 2018, been teaching, performing, and doing my best to make it happen.
I mean, what a great first piece, Chelsea 5. That's fantastic.
I mean,
what a piece to let wash over you. That's great.
Yeah.
But you're certainly not making $500,000 a year, at least, or if you
No.
are, I mean,
hardly.
Well, that's fantastic. This is, I think you might be the first saxophonist we've had, actually.
Oh, wow.
So welcome, but you're in good company. I'm a woodwindist, so I'm very at home in saxophone world. And so the three pieces we're going to eventually listen to are wonderful solos and duets and great saxophone repertoire. But I'm curious where from orchestral world, Shostakovich world, you ended up getting into saxophone, because they don't cross all that often.
Yeah, I mean, classical saxophone in itself is a weird anomaly, and it's kind of its own little niche. Kind of its own little niche kind of section of classical music. Usually, when most people think saxophone, they think jazz, they think big band, that kind of stuff. And so I do a little bit of improvisation and jazz stuff, but that's not kind of my bread and butter, so to speak. And so typically, like, at least for me, like when I started studying, doing like private lessons, like I didn't even know classical saxophone was a thing. Like, nor do most people, nor does 99% of people do, you know. Um, and so I ended up kind of exploring that route. And there's a few um, kind of orchestral roles, like actually with the saxophone. Like there's Romeo and Juliet, Prokofiev, which I've been able to do that a few times. There's pictures at an exhibition, the Old Castle. And then the lines kind of get blurred when you get into like the Gershwin stuff, like Rhapsody in Blue, American in Paris, because it's kind of jazz, kind of classical. It's its own thing. But just kind of studying that repertoire, and then ended up kind of diving into the niche classical saxophone repertoire, that canon, that kind of propelled that kind of further. And actually, I do play a little clarinet as well, so I did know kind of the classical side of things, just from playing clarinet, and like I've played an orchestral clarinet a few times, where I actually teach like clarinet at the college I teach at. But so like kind of all of that kind of pushed further in that direction, more kind of down that that trail I kind of went, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I when Jacob said, "Oh, we've got Nick coming on, and it's saxophone," I kind of had this like immediately. I was thinking, okay, Gershwin. I've got Gershwin. I got a few other things, but
Yeah.
But I mean, what about? I mean, there's those kind of the very classical repertoire, but is it? I mean, tell us a little bit about the modern repertoire for sort of classical sax, or I mean, classical in the crossover sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, like, I mean, even going back, I mean, kind of how it propelled forward. Like, there's like Debussy wrote a piece for saxophone and orchestra, and like there's some of the bigger names, like obviously Debussy, Glazunov, which usually when most people think Glazunov, they think the violin concerto, but there is a saxophone concerto that was like one of his last pieces he wrote. But kind of like in a modern sense, classical saxophone's kind of becoming kind of a fusion between the jazz and classical idioms. Like you have, I don't know if you've heard like the John Adams concerto, that it fuses a lot of jazz, like jazz language in a more modern kind of orchestral setting. And then he has other, operetta pieces like Nixon in China, which is a very heavily jazzed influence. So I think that's kind of where, kind of like where the modern kind of sets is kind of blending between these different areas. There's a little bit of jazz, a little bit of the traditional classical stuff, a little bit of minimalism, a little bit of rock. It kind of grabs a little bit of everywhere and kind of blends it all together. And then that's kind of what gets you into classical saxophone.
And certainly we're going to listen to Stuart Beach, which is a wonderful friend of the podcast. And it's definitely idiomatically saxophone, but it isn't really drawing on anything jazz. And so that's the kind of fun thing about modern, quote unquote, like jazz, not jazz, classical saxophone world, is that it really is its own thing. And I think there's something really, I always say this about wind music, and I'm like a wind person, and so I get on my own high horse a lot of the time with wind music. But I tend to think of wind music as because we have so few boundaries for us, it actually opens up so many different possibilities, because we're not held to like violin rep world. They have so many intense canon pieces that are, you can't touch them, you can't like do anything with them, and they're like really important pieces, and that's great. But it means everything else has to reference all of that other repertoire. And saxophone and modern like wind music really doesn't have a huge history, like you say, and where it does, it really is kind of like it just pops up in like some Debussy, some Glazunov, some things. And so it opens up these like wonderful worlds of composition that really aren't necessarily referential to anything else. Like they can be, but they really can just be their own world of sound. And not to like necessarily tie it to queerness, but like I tend to think of the queering of like modern classical music is in that non-referential, in that it doesn't have to connect, right?
Yeah, and like even like the definition of queer, like there is no set like parameters of what queer is or isn't. It's even just outside of music, it's what you make of it and what you want to make of it for yourself and your identity. So it's kind of in a roundabout way, like I joke about it, but like classical saxophone is kind of queer in itself just because it's what, there are no set boundaries of what you can be, can't be, um, and you can kind of make of it what you want.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, I have, and I say this just because I'm knee deep in my own like queer research for my own degrees at the moment. But like, the idea of, and it just I wrote a paper with this literally last week. The idea of
Advertising.
so now I have to talk about it. No one read it, so I have to like talk about it. But the idea of like queerness is in essence just like a disruption. Like the disruption of any norm is the queerness, and like if we put that in the music world, saxophone is the disruption. Like we don't exist in a classical sense in saxophone in so many ways, and that disruption is queerness, like in classical music. But again, my high horse, my winged and queer high horse.
Yeah.
I mean, we've started early on the queer bit. We normally don't get that till the end of the show, but we've started early. But I mean, how's it been? I mean, again, I'm trying to think about how audiences react to you in terms of, they go to I mean, obviously, when they see a concert, they know it's going to be saxophone because you're advertised as that. But how do you think they reference that? I mean, again, maybe it's a similar question, but how do audiences deal with the kind of difference that you bring to the classical music world?
Yeah, so like typically, this kind of goes on to like the whole curational side of things. Like when I start like working on like programming and stuff, I try to kind of like from a programming point, even with the Exist project, my queer, like the queer recitals, or even if it's just a normal, more standard performance, I try and use the formula where I meet them with where they know, like what they think, what they expect. So like I'll start with something jazz influenced ish, so it's okay, it's not completely new, it's not completely weird, it's something that meets them kind of where they're at, and then treat the whole performance as like a story or an arc, kind of getting them further and further out of like the comfort zone. So like if I started, the first thing they walk into and we start with atonal multiphonics and just all the disruptive type stuff, like that's gonna set the mood, and that could either be really, really intriguing for people who have never heard that, or it could be really off-putting just because, okay, we're starting with Denisov or something like that, and it's, that's just a lot to walk into, right? You have to warm them up in a sense. And so I think kind of thinking, actually thinking about the audience and, trying to take care of them just from like the from the perspective of, okay, they're sitting through an hour of long music. How do we make this, how do we make this impactful? And also like, how do, just even their tolerance levels, how do we pace it? And, having that in mind when putting together programs, putting together just even the order of pieces. Like you don't want to do 2 20-minute pieces back to back just because that's exhausting for the average listener, and so usually, with people like, I mean, in modern society, like attention spans are shorter. So like shorter pieces, that's a really good kind of way to start programs, and then build it up longer, and you can also get more, explore more kind of the further you go, because they're more warmed up to more different type of stuff, if that makes sense.
So where did the Exist program start? Where did that begin for you?
Well, so on paper, like it started a year ago, but like the whole idea of it and kind of where I wanted to go, I've had that pretty much in the back of my head for the last, probably 4 or 5 years, like even before COVID times. I've always had this idea in the back of my head just to like, when and if the time is right, I've always wanted to start something queer based. I didn't really have it defined at that, just sitting in my head, but like I wanted it, I really wanted to create something that was almost like New Music USA, or like some sort of queer foundation that just helps promote and curate queer music, art, performers, composers, all the above. And I've always just, wouldn't that be nice if there was a queer specific entity that did all that? Just because like applying for grants and whatnot, like there's always a diversity, that's always a clause, but like rarely have I ever found one that's actually queer specific. And so, that's always been like ruminating in the back of my head. And so about a little over a year ago, and this kind of ties together with the music from that we'll be listening to later. Flit's Quip by one of my friends, Evan Bogelhold. He wrote that piece for me, and we actually, I was lucky enough to premiere that in Carnegie Hall last year. And so after that, there was probably about 3 or 4 other pieces a couple friends wrote that I had commissioned, and they were all queer and ended up being kind of queer-based programmatically, like with the stories behind them. And so I had probably I would say about 30, maybe 40 minutes of just like queer composed music that I was just sitting on. And I wanted to record an album, and I'm working on it right now. But so basically I put out a Facebook post saying, hey, I have, about 40 minutes. All I need is really about 1 or 2 more pieces. Is there any interest? Would anyone be interested in kind of working together on something like this, on a project like this? And then social media did its thing, and it got a lot of positive reactions from that. And so to the tune of, I think about 40 or so different composers were interested in working together. And, that kind of was just kind of like the ignition that was like, okay, I need to actually make this a thing, work on this. Obviously my wallet does not want me to do this right now, but excluding that parameter, like, I think this is the right time to make this happen. And so far, lucky enough, everything's been able to work, and we're moving forward with it. And like eventually I wanted to actually break into its own kind of nonprofit entity that does fund other music besides saxophone music. I wanted to fund clarinet music, flute, violin, orchestral, vocal. I want the project to eventually be removed from myself in the sense where I'm not the main performer,
Yeah.
So maybe for the audience members who aren't quite as familiar, maybe just explain a little bit more about specifically what the goals of the project are.
Yeah, so the I Exist project was basically founded on the premise of promoting queer music and music by composers and performers, and specifically the queer culture and narratives with that music. So sharing stories of queerness through music, through different performers, and promoting new music through all of that.
And is this kind of like you say it's kind of still linked to you at the moment? Is this like a regional US thing, or are you planning to expand it over the US?
So right now, I mean, you brought up Stewart. Like Stewart was the first actual international composer with the project. Was really exciting to have him write a piece. But yeah, so like right now we've the project's commissioned about, I believe, 30 new pieces, all for that's eventually going to be performed all over the country. Right now in this season, I have about 20 or 25 scheduled performances for the project, and so it's literally all over the country in the United States right now, and planning on recording the first volume of stuff end of summer next year, and then work on the next set of stuff. So it's really been about creating new repertoire and specifically new queer repertoire. And so right now, a lot of the stuff is saxophone and saxophone with piano, just because it's easy for me to perform this stuff because I don't have to hire myself, big air quotes, to learn all this stuff. Like I don't have to, you know what I mean? So it's easy on that front. But like right now, the next kind of steps, we have an emerging student composer award right now. And so this next year is for pretty much saxophone plus any collaborative instrument. But like in the next few years, I really wanted to branch out to, when we select like the students of that, the piece of that is not saxophone specific, and we find, have a network of different performers that we work with that, eventually have a piece written for them.
That's fantastic. Very good. So
Thank you.
we should probably listen to one of the pieces then. Maybe let's start with Stuart's because it's the one we've been talking about the most. But tell us about Stuart's piece for you.
Yeah, so Stuart wrote the next piece on queer survival, and it really is about just addressing the targeted violence from queer, in queer culture. Uh, this is actually probably like one of the most emotionally like just taxing ones to talk about, like in the middle of a performance, because it very much is in response to, targeted violence and those who have not made it through that. And so we actually, Alex and I, Alex Lee, who's the collaborative pianist who's been touring all over the country with me with this, we actually performed this and premiered this in Fort Collins, Colorado, about a month or so ago. And that was pretty demanding and just hard emotionally because that's about 60 miles south of Laramie, Wyoming, where Matthew Shepard had the attacks and was lynched. And we found out later afterwards, after the attack, he was actually brought to a hospital in Fort Collins, which was about half a mile away from where we performed. And so just that hits very hard. And so whenever we bring that up, and this is also, the 25th anniversary of the attack. And so like just all of those pieces together just makes it very difficult to talk about like in the middle of a performance, because you're performing it and then you have to go back and talk meaningfully about it. And it just hits so hard. But yeah, no, that's in essence what his piece is about. And also kind of as a tribute to all those who have not made it through whatever attacks or violence that they face.
I think we'll take a listen then.
it's interesting that you say that the piece is emotionally difficult to play or talk about and then play, um, because my first thought listening to it was, uh, as a player listening to it and how I would then play it myself, because I often put myself in the player's head, and I think it's difficult to ride that line between staying in the moment of being the musician, um, with all the mechanics and technicals that you need to like figure out, but also being the artist and the queer person and bringing that, um, emotion and rawness to it. And oftentimes those are at odds. Like I think it is, um, maybe more difficult than maybe listeners would kind of recognize to, be able to play that specific piece with all the good, wonderful tone and air and support and things that you have, but also, uh, keeping all of the other stuff in mind, all of the reasons that it was written, and all of that, um, emotional weight, behind it. And I'm wondering how you kind of, walk that line, because it is really difficult to not let the saxophoneness drop while keeping it going.
Yeah, so like this kind of ties into kind of something I talk about when like I'm doing like different outreaches or master classes with like different like university students, either before or after these performances. And so it's just interesting because, when we talk about repertoire in general, just broadly right now, usually when a musician, interpreter, or student professional interprets a piece of music, it's always what is the story that goes with it, or what's the made up story, or what is, how do we hyperimpose an event from our life, onto this piece of music to like give it that extra special emotional meaning or whatever, right? Um, and then, and usually it's like, okay, this is about my goldfish dying or whatever, right? um, but I think for me, like like this piece specifically, or even just any of the queer repertoire that I'm working on, it hits a little bit differently that I've noticed, just because these stories they're real. Like, that's kind of the center of the project, is these stories are real. People, it isn't just rainbows and sunshines, right? People die. And like, we've all had it where we've all been, we've all faced, just different attacks on different levels. Obviously, um, not like nothing that terrible has happened because we're here, but at the same time, we've all faced violence, or prejudice at some point in our life, and we can relate to that just because it's part of our community. And so when it comes to like an actual in the moment performance setting, it's hard to, when I talk about that, what the piece means, what it represents, I have to take probably about 5 to 10, you probably more like 15 seconds just to ground myself, just to be able to physically perform it, just because it is so emotional. And there are moments where, sometimes the pauses end up taking a little bit more time, just because you have to, I want it to be an emotional experience, but I also, if the emotions take too far control, then you sacrifice things in the performance. And so it's how do you ride that line? And you almost just kind of have to be mentally grounded the whole time, just knowing this is going to be an emotional roller coaster. Buckle up, but like take the time you need when, there's a fermata or there's a pause, or um, the nice thing is with like Stewart's piece, there's like an aleatoric, like in the middle. Um, the piano does this like repetitive kind of ostinato aleatoric type pattern. So I can take more time in the middle of that if I need to, just to ground myself for an extra second. Like the performance is not ruined from that. I don't have that luxury with other pieces that are more technical, but when you have moments like that, that's kind of how I approach it, is let myself express and feel the emotions I need to. But if there's a moment where there's a long dramatic pause, or there's a fermata or other stuff going on where I can take a moment more, that's usually where I kind of have that planned in, where, okay, this is where you can process, kind of recoup emotionally, if that makes sense.
I mean, we had Stuart on 3 or 4 months ago, I think it was. And I must admit, I think he would be really pleased with what you did with it. I have to say, I mean, I thought what I wrote when I listened to it was beautifully expressive, and what you did with it, I think, was fantastic. And obviously reading up a little bit about the story and understanding just from the title what it was, I think was deeply effective. So I think it was. I mean, I don't think I would be able to not end up in tears going through it if I had to do something of that emotional. So but it was
Thank
wonderfully
you.
expressive. So I think you did a fantastic job.
Well, yeah, and like almost every time, I end up in tears afterwards. Like that is very much that takes a moment just to get out of that, because it is one of the darker pieces on the program.
Yeah, but I think it says something that both you and Stuart together here have created a piece that can do that to people and make them feel that way. So for me, that is kind of, it's yeah, I don't even know the right word to use here, because you want to say it's fantastic, but it isn't fantastic because the story's so dark. So
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean that's hard to be like, you want to say I love the piece, but like you don't want to, like, you love the music, you don't love the reason why the music is, was influenced the way it was. I mean, it's incredibly beautiful. It's just tragic that, based on what's inspired on, like, that is the true tragedy of it.
I'm curious who your audiences have been so far for this. Do you find you're drawing mainly from queer community, or do you find people are bringing kind of friends? What's the demographic been?
I would say it's about 50-50 right now. So a lot of the outreaches we've been doing the past few months and how we schedule are through different just universities around the country. And so it's a mix of people from the community. It's a mix of students and faculty. And then, but then also, like, with outreaches, we've reached out to different LGBTQ like associations, like the one we did in Fort Collins. Like, there was a whole like a book club, I think. I don't know I think it was like a queer book club in Fort Collins. Like, a lot of older, queer people came from hearing from that. So it's kind of a eclectic kind of group when you actually kind of analyze the different audience group of that. And like, we have a few, our next concert coming up on November 10th is actually at the Kansas City Library. So that's going to be a very eclectic group, because it's going to be probably from people all over, just all sorts of different backgrounds, from even just the community in Kansas City, because they're promoting it within their library circle. And then obviously it's going to be, because it's my hometown, it's going to be a lot of family friends for this one, but also, who knows who else will show up,
Very interesting.
So maybe we should talk about the next piece, which is coming up, which I would want to do next. Resonances, maybe, is that the next one to go for? So maybe tell us a little bit about that. That's one of your bits, one of your pieces.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny because, of all the things I do, like, whenever I compose stuff like that, is the most just internal imposter syndrome type thing I have on myself. It had to be what it is. But so yeah, no way. I premiered that with a good friend, Eddie Goodman, a couple of weeks ago in the University of Arizona. And that basically came about because when we were, like, I'm just going to start off with, like, I've always loved his playing, and like, we've always, like, mutually admired each other. And so when I was scheduling the visit performance at his university, we really wanted to do something together. We really wanted to play together. We wanted to do something collaborative. And so life happens, as we all know, and we decided about, like, the week or two before, hey, we should probably figure out what we're playing together. And so at that point, we're both busy. Um, and with, let's just say 2 weeks of preparation time, it's like, okay, what can we do with what can we do with as minimal effort as possible for a maximum amount of result, right? And so, kind of going back to the canon of classical saxophone, there's a few cute pieces. I mean, they're really nice pieces from like the 19th century, very parlor, chamber parlor type kind of stuff. But kind of going back to programming and aesthetically, like that doesn't match the program one bit, and that'd be a pretty hard left turn going from, you know, um, anything queer related to, okay, we're going to do a random saxophone parlor piece from Belgium from 1850 because that's what we're doing. And
it would
so
keep the audience on their toes.
yeah. So, and then also, so I was looking for random stuff that we could do that was fairly easy to put together and queer composed, and like nothing really really fit all the check marks. And so I was just like, you know what, I'll write something, I'll figure something out, I'll write something. And I wrote that piece in about a day or two, but I really kind of approached it kind of literally with the title. So Resonance is playing off, just the beauty of when two saxophones are together, like just the sound with the harmonics are really aligned, and they play even just a simple major third, like just the beauty of the overtones of all of that. And it's really simplistic but effective at the same time. So I ended up writing, I think it's about 4 or 5 minutes of, it's melodic, but it's not at the same time, kind of almost in protest in a sense of other modern saxophone music, because it either goes into the very higher, faster, louder, kind of very technically just demanding type of works, to this is almost minimalistic, where if you look at the page, it's nothing but whole notes. And it's not even measured. It's not even metered. It's very organic, where, you kind of choose your own adventure with that. There's no real phrase marking. It's, and it kind of plays along with the title and meaning behind it. Also just resonance between, two performers, two players together when, when you're playing with someone, well, it just, you two click together, and it naturally, the performance naturally resonates within itself, just doing it together. So that's kind of how that all kind of came about.
Let's take a listen then.
There's something really always magical about like two saxophones. I think it's such a rarely heard combo. Like we really don't have duets of like just two saxophones often. The one that I mean immediately comes to mind, not to not talk about your piece for a second, but there's a quartet by Chen Yi for wind ensemble and four saxophones, which is wild because who has four soloists as four saxophone soloists in one piece as a quartet? But it's super rare. It's a really rare thing to hear that timbre by itself, and so it's so lovely to hear at the same time. It's really quite nice. What I mean, I know you said it was kind of like put together within a short time frame, as things often maybe are. But what's the life of it afterwards? Like, have you done it a couple times, or was the premiere just the first time? Or
well, the premiere was literally like 12 days ago, so I have not had a chance to do it yet. But actually, like a couple of students from that performance wanted to perform it on their duo recital, so I ended up kind of re-editing some things, and so it's going to have a life from that. And I think, kind of even tying back to the program, like I'm going to use it more also as a when I'm in a place where there's I have a friend who plays saxophone, maybe I'll rearrange it for another instrument, but I really actually like it for two saxophones. But it could be just a strong piece of, just showing allyship or, togetherness within the community. And so I think I have a few other performances of it sprinkled around, but I mean, honestly, as far as I know, I don't know. Like, we'll see where it goes. And that's kind of that, and that kind of ties back to the imposter syndrome composer within me. It's like, I don't write, whenever I write stuff, I don't write stuff to, this sounds horrible, but like I don't write to, huge air quotes, promote my own composition or like, do anything with it per se. Like I write it for the moment for, what I need. And if it gets attention and it's beautiful, awesome. And I just, use it kind of when it's needed.
composer of circumstance.
Yeah. And like, I mean, with that being said, like I like to think like I do a decent job. Like I'm not going to win a Grammy from this or any means, but like, I'm proud of it. Like it's good. But that's just a hard kind of thing I've dealt with myself, even just like almost coming out as a composer. Like I'm like tiptoeing around it, kind of just like, am I one? Am I not? I don't know.
I thought it was very, when I listened to it, I thought it was very melancholy. I thought it was kind of, it was kind of one of those sort of things that had it was relaxing, but had a sort of a slight melancholy feel to it. So it sort of made you feel a little bit uncomfortable from time to time, but just kind of went on with those, as you say, with those lovely resonances in it, which was nice. And actually, when I was thinking about it, it's what you just said. It actually struck me because you just said about another instrument. I think any instrument, it would probably work really well with any instruments that have lots of overtones in it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a very pure instrument, it probably wouldn't, but sort of lots of overtones.
Yeah.
And I must also say, Jacob, I will introduce you afterwards to the William Tell Overture played entirely on saxophones. If you've never heard it, it is simply one of the most outrageous things you'll ever hear. So,
What a monstrosity.
yeah,
There's,
but the whole thing on it is,
there's again, not to go down too many different
Yeah.
rabbit holes, but there's Bugler's Holiday, which is like a very famous trumpety piece. But Bugler's Holiday, it has become a thing that every instrument group, every wind instrument group, likes to do as a little party trick. And so there are
Mhm.
recordings of bassoons doing Bugler's Holiday,
Oh my
saxophones doing Bugler's Holiday. There's a quartet of bass clarinets doing Bugler's Holiday, and it is also a monstrosity. It is also an abomination, but it is very good. Yeah.
you should definitely get them all to do the William Tell Overture, because
Yeah.
that makes anything sound really strange.
Yeah.
If I see that on Nick's latest thing, you know where the idea came from.
Well, they're actually, I mean, if you want to talk about just like obnoxious, like saxophone choir stuff, there's one piece, I forget like its actual, like the proper title, but basically it's a mashup of William Tell Overture, like all the like classical isms, like it mashes up, it's called Sax Ranger Goes Mad. You need to look this up, like that, or the Lone Ranger or something, like the Lone Ranger Goes Sax Mad or something like that. But it mashes up William Tell, 1812, like just all the like Brahms lullabies, just all the like classical trope things into like this like 3-minute like monstrosity of just all of those isms in one piece.
Probably made them $1 million. Probably made them.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. Let's just say to the audience, feel free to listen to Nick's resonances, because it doesn't sound anything like that. It is a really nice piece of music.
But I will say, to tie us in, like, again, saxophone is able to do those weird things. Like, we can do those strange things on saxophone. You never see violinists doing this. A group of violinists would never get something that would embarrass the hell out of them, and they would never, ever do it. But wind players will. We'll do anything weird and strange.
Request, please, to Jacob and Nick doing strange things with their instruments. Send them in, and we'll arrange it.
I can probably make that happen.
Yeah. So let's go back to your composing, because you said you feel an imposter, which I think is kind of probably true for anyone who's kind of good at their things they do. I mean, how long have you been? I mean, have you been composing since you were a lot younger, or is this something you've just sort of got into, or?
Oh, well, I mean, I kind of just did it out of like necessity. Like I've never, like, okay, so like for example, like throughout like both my like college degrees, like in my undergrad, I took an arranging class just because I had credits to fill. So like I ended up arranging like part of Bartok's Mikrokosmos for like full orchestra for the final, just because what else am I going to do, you know? And then like in grad school, like I ended up taking all of the like all the counterpoint stuff, like fugue writing, counterpoint class, all that, like all those kind of theory classes, just because it's always like intrigued me. And I, you know, if I'm going to take a theory class, like I want to do something somewhat, I mean, I don't think writing a fugue is practical by any means, but you know, like that, I always loved fugues, and I'm a sucker for, you know, a good, like just a very good, like well-written fugue. And so I ended up writing for that. And like I wrote like little ditties, like here and there, like literally like just random stuff. And like I ended up writing some like short jazz tunes, just like lead sheets with like, okay, here's a simple melody, here's a chord changes, and then improvise with those. But like as far as like big air quotes professional composing type stuff, I would say, you know, kind of during the pandemic, that's probably when I kind of started diving into that kind of more just out of, you know, what else is there to do, you know, especially like the first few months. And so I ended up, yeah, it was a lawless time. Like I ended up writing like these set of caprices that were basically modeled after like the Paganini
Oh,
violin,
right.
like those. And so they were basically my challenge to, okay, how hard can I write? How crazy and hard can I write like a caprice like this? And so most of them, um, yeah, no, there's one that like I listened to a recording of me playing and I was like, gee, like how did I ever do this? And I was like, oh wait, I chugged Red Bull right before that because it's just like a million miles per hour. um, but out of like the 8 or 10 I did, like there's only one that like I still pull out just because it just kind of resonated with. I think it was the best one out of the whole batch, and it's inherently the most melodic one, um, and it kind of follows like a Bach Chaconne-ish type of progression vibe type of thing, and so I just I break that out whenever, kind of just out of necessity. Like I'm doing a program, I need 4 minutes of something to kill. What do I do? I'll just whip out my thing because I wrote it. Like I should be able to play it usually, but after like a few minutes of practice, yeah,
You Red Bulls back and you're fine. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, I mean that's pretty much where, just kind of like my compositional where I'm at. I mean, I kind of tend to take whatever, I mean, this probably happens with everyone, I assume. Um, Kind of whatever you're listening to kind of ends up coming out kind of what you're writing or comes out in the writing. And so like during that time, like I was listening to, I don't know why I was listening to the Paganini stuff, but apparently I was. And so that's how those all came about. And like with this, um, I've been listening to like a lot of, like Steve Reich, like the desert music for like full orchestra voices and whatnot. And so I think that kind of comes out in a roundabout way, just like the tension and also just, kind of like the minimalistic side of things with it. So
It makes perfect sense. We
yeah,
a lot of what we're listening to. Yeah. Well, I think you should compose more. I think this is a fun new adventure maybe for you. But the last piece we have to listen to, wonderful ending to our little program, but Flitzquip. So tell us about this one because it's a little different from the other two.
yeah. So this is definitely the more kind of in vein with the more virtuosic, just pyrotechnic type stuff. But at the same time, it's still melodic and it's, I mean, it's not I feel like this is not one of those pieces that are virtuosic for the sake of being virtuosic. It's more, it's kind of in line with the nature of the piece. So Flitzquip, pretty much how it kind of translates or what the meaning of it is basically like a fast, quick-witted comment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, if you've ever been to a, drag performance or something like that, like there's nothing but those galore. So this is kind of in that kind of vein where, witty response, comment and like fast in that response. And so I feel like the piece is pretty in line with that kind of description. Like it's very, like goes back and forth. And so my friend Evan, he ended up writing that, and it just showed up in my inbox one day. And he was like, "Hey, I wrote you a piece. Do what you want with this." And I was like, "Oh my god, like this is amazing." And so I was probably sitting on it for like a year or so because like it just showed up in my inbox like in the middle of COVID, which no one was doing performances. Really, there weren't much going on at that point. And so kind of fast forward to last year, I was lucky enough and fortunate enough to perform in Carnegie Hall twice. And so the first time we did a more kind of standard program, and then the second time, which was like literally a month or like a month or like 45 days later, like it was a quick turnaround.
Mm.
The pianist and I, Maya, we were like, okay, we're literally coming back here in like almost a month. How do we like for the, how do we one up ourselves? Like you don't just go back and do the same thing. So like, how do we one up ourselves? And so we were like, you know what? Why don't we premiere this piece? Like that's a pretty big one up compared to, for a second performance. So we premiered that in Carnegie Hall, and it was awesome. Like as every performance there, like as those always are, but like we got like all the woos and stuff from the audience. Like it was fun. And it's a pretty much like we kind of use it now as like either a really fun start to a program or as like an encore piece, because it's really perfect for one of those, like it's perfect at either end. I feel like kind of either energizes up, or it's a very like great way to kind of leave a performance. So that's kind of where that's all at.
I loved this piece. I thought it was fantastic. I loved the alto sax. It was just, fantastic. And for me, it had this really big feel to it. I know it sounds maybe it felt like it felt very American. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing to say, but it felt very big, in a big spatial, like American way, like I guess some pieces from the 1930s, 40s, 50s felt like, has that sort of Americana feel to it, very big. And I thought that was really great. I mean, I love the other, but this was fantastic. As you say, to finish the show, as it were, it was just really energizing.
Thank you.
It also made me think I should listen to more saxophone music. Well, after this, I talked to my wife. I said, "Yeah, we interviewed this guy who plays the sax." And she goes, "What, classical sax?" I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "Is there such a thing?" And I said, "Look, I'll show you afterwards. I'll show you afterwards because actually, I think it is kind of fascinating. I think it sounds I think because we don't hear it, it sounds so different and so incredible. I think that's the thing. I kind of it's so different. I don't even know how to explain it properly. You know what I mean? It's a different set of nerves or something, or a different sound.
Just the acoustics of it, or and like if you go down like the rabbit hole, like there's saxophonists, and it's even part of the repertoire where they'll do transcriptions of traditional, even more traditional like string repertoire. Like they'll do the Franck violin sonata, or they'll do Bach flute sonatas or stuff like that, and it really. I mean, for me, it's normal because like this is the world I live in. But like from what I've heard from like a lot of people, when they hear, let's just say like a violin sonata performed on saxophone for the first time, they're like, a lot of comments is that the first few comments that you'll get is, "Wow, I didn't even know a saxophone could do that." And two, it'll be that was like a completely different piece. Like they knew they were listening to the same notes, same rhythm, same everything, but it's just a completely different. It literally sounds like a completely different composition almost at that point.
Yeah.
But when done well, like it, I would also say saxophonists are daring enough where there's a lot of, we do ever like as a community, like we love the challenge. So if there's like a crazy arpeggio section in the violin Mendelssohn concerto, whatever, like we're crazy enough where we're like, yeah, we'll work on it and spend 2 years to work on it and you pull it off, and then we'll pull it off. Like we're the crazy ones who will try it.
I mean, do you think it's partly due to? I mean, I kind of hadn't thought this through, so excuse me if I get down a very unusual rabbit hole here. And if it's two wind people, maybe you can explain this. I mean, do you think there is this? I mean, in terms of a saxophone, it has this kind of, and I don't mean this in a nasty way, like a dirty feel to it. It's not a clear tonal resonance to it. It's got as you say, it's got all these overtones and this kind of thing in it, and that is. I mean, I get the feeling that's kind of unusual to hear in a classical sense. I mean, you do hear it, and I guess you do it, Jacob. I know we've talked about this. Your clarinet, by doing different blowing techniques, you generate all these extra harmonics and this kind of thing. So is this? Do you think we're hearing like a new? What am I trying to say here? A new spectral sort of thing of area of like which for an audience. You're hearing something so different that it it's familiar, but it is this kind of extra stuff to it that it's carrying because of all these extra resonances or something. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but
no, I mean that makes total sense. Like you hear a pianissimo low D on a violin, like it's going to be very pure, especially if they're doing the mute thing. Like it's a very pure sound. With saxophone or flute or bassoon or any instrument like wind instrument, there's going to be more. Sometimes you'll hear air noise, or sometimes you'll hear like the actual noise of the instrument, like just the instrument breathing. But like even going back, like when the saxophone was invented, like it was kind of meant to be this bridge. It was kind of built to be the instrument that could do anything. So it was meant to have the the sound of a woodwind, the pyrotechnics blend of a string instrument, and then also the power of a brass instrument.
Really?
Yeah, I mean that's Adolf Sax wanted it to be a core part of the orchestra, and now that didn't happen because it's a long story. There's a lot of scandal. Like long story short, people didn't like that he had actually invented this. And I mean, if you look like it at original, 19th century saxophone, it looks like a modern saxophone. Like it hasn't changed a whole lot. If you look at like the history of like the flute or the clarinet, like you can trace it back thousands of years because it's constantly evolving. But so because Adolf Sax made pretty much a more or less a perfectly working instrument, like on the first get-go with the patent, and that's not like an egotistical thing. Like it literally, like there was very little like that had to be done because it worked. It worked. A lot of the instrument makers of the time, like the clarinetists and whatnot, they did not like that competition and that level of competition, and so they like there's a whole book of like people that like references like all these companies like hired hitmen to like no, seriously, like they hired like hitmen to They tried to burn down his factory in Paris a few times. They tried to have hitmen take out Adolf, like seriously. And then also to the point where they would also pay like the orchestra members and composers to not actually write for the saxophone in the orchestra. And so that kind of perpetuated why it's not in the orchestra, not because composers didn't like it. Like there was like Rossini loved it, Berlioz loved it, all those core romantic, they loved it. They just couldn't write for it, because then if they didn't write for it, then their piece wouldn't get played, or their orchestra would get like burnt down in the middle of the performance or something.
That's incredible. I have no idea that clarinetists were so upset, Jacob.
We're a very uptight group, let me tell you.
Well, I mean, it was a double whammy, because he also did that with the bass clarinet. That's why the bass clarinet has like that saxophone shaped kind of bell at the bottom, and why it's metal. Same guy. So and he was a pretty good like clarinet maker as well. And so it was kind of that we don't like that you're better than all of us, so we're going to team up against you and we're going to make this as miserable as possible.
The world of classical music is such a, backstabbing bunch of people.
It's so true.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think probably that's a good place to end it. Honestly, I thank you, Nick, for your time. It's been fantastic. It's opened up a whole new world of music for me to actually look into this. So thank you so much, and I hope it does the same for some of our listeners as well.
Thank you so much.
So that's all for this episode. You've been listening to the Classical Queer podcast, and Jacob and I look forward to being with you next month. The incidental music is courtesy of Jared Miller, and the show was produced by Samantha Jane.